June 1940. Camp 173, Lancashire, England. The steam rising from the porcelain cup hypnotized the German soldier who had never seen anything like it. After months of lightning warfare across Europe, subsisting on field rations and bottled water, this hot amber liquid called tea represented impossibility made real. It cost nothing, the guard informed him, and was served to British citizens from childhood through old age, 5 or 6 times daily. Across British prison camps that summer, 10,457 German POWs would confront a reality that contradicted everything Nazi propaganda had taught them about British savagery. They discovered a nation where tea breaks were sacrosanct ritual, where crumpets and scones were everyday fare, where cricket matches occupied entire afternoons. These simple customs, practices that propaganda had dismissed as evidence of British weakness and decadence, would systematically demolish Nazi ideology more effectively than any counter-indoctrination program. The mathematics of civility were being written in tea leaves and measured patience, in polite conversation and quiet dignity, revealing a British cultural resilience that rendered German brutality not necessary toughness, but barbaric regression. What began as amazement at British restraint would evolve into complete psychological transformation. The Dunkirk evacuation, the collapse of France in June 1940, left approximately 40,000 British troops stranded on the continent while simultaneously placing thousands of German soldiers in British hands. These Wehrmacht soldiers, who had conquered Western Europe with unprecedented speed, expected harsh treatment as prisoners. Nazi propaganda had prepared them for British vengeance, describing in vivid detail the torture and starvation that awaited captured German soldiers. Instead, within hours of capture, they encountered British military discipline applied to hospitality. These enemy soldiers, who had just days earlier been firing upon British troops, received tea served in proper cups with milk and sugar available despite rationing. German soldiers who had survived on minimal rations during the Blitzkrieg treated these small ceremonies as inexplicable luxuries. According to military records, at the processing camps in southern England, the British Army served tea at 6 am, 10 am, 1 pm, 4 pm, and 8 pm, maintaining the home routine despite war conditions. The systematic provision of this national ritual to enemies began immediately, though its psychological impact would only be understood later. A German officer later testified to the International Red Cross, "We expected to be beaten or at least intimidated. Instead, the British Guards offered tea and apologized for the inconvenience of our capture. This confusion about British character began our education." The transport ships carrying POWs to permanent camps throughout Britain provided intensive education in British stoicism. These vessels, navigating waters under constant threat of U-boat attack, maintained British routines despite the danger. Naval records show that prisoner accommodations, while simple, adhered strictly to Geneva Convention requirements. Most remarkably, documented accounts confirm that tea service continued uninterrupted despite wartime conditions, with designated tea breaks observed even during submarine alerts. The HMS Royal Ulsterman's log, from June 1940, records serving tea to prisoners at precisely 4 p.m. while evading suspected U-boat activity off the Scottish coast. For men who had been told British sailors would throw them overboard, this maintenance of civility during crisis defied understanding. When ships docked at ports like Liverpool and Glasgow, German POWs encountered a Britain that Nazi propaganda had declared impossible. Liverpool docks, despite heavy bombing, continued functioning with remarkable efficiency. At these points of entry, prisoners glimpsed British civilians queuing patiently for rationed goods, maintaining orderly lines without supervision. Military procurement records from 1940 show standard rations for POWs identical to those provided British troops. Tea, 2 ounces weekly, sugar, 8 ounces, powdered milk, and occasional biscuits. The journey inland by train provided further education. Despite being enemy combatants responsible for bombing British cities, German POWs travelled in standard passenger carriages rather than cattle cars. Documented schedules from summer 1940 show regular stops for tea service at station canteens, the same facilities serving British travellers. POWs discovered this wasn't special treatment, but standard British rail procedure even during wartime. The prison camp system constructed across Britain housed POWs in conditions that not only met, but exceeded Geneva Convention requirements. Camp 173 in Lancashire, typical of the facilities, included basic but adequate accommodations with crucial amenities like tea kettles in common areas. According to Army Quartermaster records, camp provisions included weekly tea rations of 2 ounces per man, precisely matching the civilian ration. Prisoners observed the guards' reverence for tea breaks, noting how hostilities seemed to pause during these rituals. German military training had emphasized British decadence and weakness, but these prisoners witnessed something different: a society maintaining cultural constants despite existential threat, deriving strength from tradition rather than abandoning it under pressure. As summer turned to autumn in 1940, with Britain standing alone against Nazi Germany and the Luftwaffe bombing London nightly, German prisoners watched in disbelief as their British guards continued serving tea with steady hands at precisely the same times each day. This unwavering adherence to civility in the face of potential invasion would begin a profound reconsideration of everything these soldiers had been taught about their enemy and, ultimately, about themselves. The golden amber liquid poured from the teapot in a perfect arc, steam rising in delicate curls, as the British Guard demonstrated the proper technique. Tea must draw for precisely 4 minutes, he explained to the German officer watching intently. Not 3, certainly not 5. This lesson in tea preparation occurred not in a London drawing room, but in Camp 17, Yorkshire, where Wehrmacht soldiers were receiving an unexpected education in British civilization. The British tea ritual stretched back centuries, evolving from a luxury of the elite to a national unifier crossing class boundaries. What began as an aristocratic affectation had, by 1940, become the rhythm by which Britain measured its days. The British consumed over 485,000 tons of tea annually before the war, approximately 9.5 pounds per person yearly. Even under wartime rationing, the government ensured each civilian received 2 ounces weekly, considering tea essential to national morale. Prisoner camps adhered to this same ration, a fact documented in Ministry of Food records from 1940-1945. Daily life in POW camps followed the tea clock with remarkable precision. Morning tea arrived at 6:40 a.m., delivered to barracks before prisoners rose. Mid-morning tea at 10 a.m. provided brief respite from work duties. Afternoon tea at 4 p.m. represented the most elaborate service, occasionally accompanied by biscuits or, on special occasions, cake. Evening tea at 8 p.m. concluded the day. Military records from Camp 23 in Scotland show this schedule maintained without interruption for 1,126 consecutive days during the war. The material culture of British tea arrived intact despite wartime shortages. Standard issue per 100 prisoners included 12 teapots, capacity 6 cups each, 120 teacups with saucers, 12 milk jugs, 12 sugar bowls, 24 teaspoons. Quartermaster requisition forms from 1941 show replacement orders maintaining these exact quantities throughout the war. Prison camp tea services, while functional rather than decorative, maintained essential British standards. Porcelain cups rather than tin mugs, proper teapots rather than urns. German prisoners observed with amazement the democratization of this ritual. Guards and prisoners drank identical tea, prepared in identical fashion. The camp commandant at Featherstone Park was documented drinking from the same teapot as German generals. This equality of refreshment contradicted Nazi hierarchical principles fundamentally. The tea itself came primarily from India and Ceylon, 97% of Britain's supply according to Board of Trade statistics. Even as German U-boats sank cargo vessels, the British government prioritised tea shipments, allocating precious shipping space to this seemingly non-essential commodity. The British would rather lose the war than their afternoon tea, one POW wrote home. This letter, censored but preserved in military archives, reveals early recognition of British determination. International Red Cross representatives inspecting British camps regularly noted tea service as exceeding requirements. Their reports, filed quarterly, documented exemplary adherence to civilized treatment and maintenance of cultural standards despite wartime conditions. Sugar presented a particularly powerful contrast. In Germany, sugar rations for civilians had been reduced to 8.75 ounces monthly by 1940. In British POW camps, each prisoner received 8 ounces weekly, equal to the civilian and military ration. Camp 28 requisition records show 112 pounds of sugar delivered weekly for 224 prisoners in January 1941. Milk, increasingly scarce as the war progressed, remained available for tea, with POW camps receiving 1 or 4 pint daily per prisoner, identical to the British homefront ration. Crumpets and scones appeared on Sunday afternoon tea menus in many camps, introducing Germans to distinctly British fare. Camp bakers, often prisoners with pre-war bakery experience, were provided ingredients according to traditional British recipes. A German baker at Camp Sutton Coldfield recalled in post-war interviews, "They insisted I learn precise British methods. The crumpets had to have exactly 7 holes showing on top, or they were considered failures." The ritual aspects of tea service confused prisoners initially. The careful warming of the pot, the precise timing of brewing, the specific order of milk and sugar. These practices seemed incomprehensibly elaborate during global war. One prisoner recorded in his diary, recovered during camp decommissioning in 1946, "They continue these tea ceremonies while their cities burn." Either this represents madness or a form of cultural courage we have not understood. The afternoon tea ritual included complex etiquette that guards attempted to convey. Cups held with finger and thumb, pinky extended slightly, but not affectedly. Saucers used when standing, not when seated. Spoons placed beside cups after stirring, never left standing in the cup. These details, trivial in isolation, accumulated into a portrait of civilization maintained through precise behavior. German officers initially suspected psychological warfare. One Luftwaffe captain wrote in a letter, intercepted by censors, "Perhaps they mean to confuse us with kindness, to make us soft before interrogation." This suspicious assessment gradually gave way to genuine appreciation. The predictability of the ritual provided psychological stability in the uncertainty of captivity. By Christmas 1940, many camps reported German prisoners adapting to British tea customs with unexpected enthusiasm. Camp commanders noted decreased discipline problems coinciding with acceptance of the tea ritual. Ministry of War records from February 1941 document a 42% reduction in reported incidents at camps where full tea service had been implemented, compared to transit facilities where the ritual was abbreviated. The teacup emerged as an unlikely symbol of British cultural strength, the willingness to maintain standards regardless of circumstances. German prisoners who had expected brutality found instead a society where propriety and process remained sacred even with enemies. The thin porcelain cups, delicate but durable, became metaphors for British character itself, refined but remarkably resilient. The kitchen at Camp 21 in Comrie, Scotland, hummed with organised activity as British Army cooks worked alongside German prisoners preparing the day's meals. The rich, yeasty aroma of rising dough filled the air as a Wehrmacht baker, who had once served in a Berlin patisserie, carefully shaped crumpets for afternoon tea. Under the watchful eye of a British sergeant, he measured precisely 5 ounces of flour per batch, the exact ration allocated to prisoners and guards alike. British camp kitchens operated with remarkable efficiency despite wartime shortages. The Ministry of Food established a clear nutritional policy in July 1940. German prisoners would receive exactly the same rations as British troops. This directive, documented in War Office Memorandum WO 32-1091-9, demonstrated British commitment to Geneva Convention standards despite severe rationing on the home front. Camp commissary records showed daily caloric provisions averaging 3,100 calories per prisoner, considerably more than the 2,800 calories available to British civilians. The daily menu pattern followed traditional British meal structure. Breakfast at 7:30 a.m. typically included porridge, 1.5 ounces oats per person, bread, 8 ounces daily ration, margarine, 2 ounces weekly, and tea. Lunch at 12:30 p.m. featured a main course such as stew, potatoes, vegetables, and a simple pudding. Dinner at 6 p.m. provided another hot meal, often featuring preserved meat, root vegetables, and bread. Sunday meals received special attention, with roast beef and Yorkshire pudding appearing monthly when supplies permitted. Military documentation from Camp 186 in Colchester reveals typical weekly rations per prisoner. Bread, 56 ounces, meat, 21 ounces, potatoes 5 pounds, vegetables 14 ounces, sugar 8 ounces, margarine 5 ounces, tea 2 ounces, cheese 8 ounces, and jam 4 ounces. These allocations, while modest, matched British military standards exactly and exceeded civilian rations in several categories. German prisoners found British food unfamiliar rather than inadequate. According to recovered diary entries, many initially complained about bland flavours and overcooked vegetables. One prisoner from Hamburg wrote, "The English boil everything until it surrenders completely. Their potatoes wave the white flag before reaching the table." However, as months passed, appreciation for the consistent quality and fair distribution developed. A Bavarian soldier noted in letters home, intercepted by censors but preserved in archives, "We receive exactly what our guards eat, the same portions from the same pots." This equality seems fundamental to them, even with enemies. Crumpets became a particular source of cultural exchange and confusion. These distinctly British griddle cakes, with their spongy texture and honeycomb surface, represented an entirely new food experience for most Germans. Camp baking lessons became informal cultural exchanges. A British Army cook at Camp Featherstone explained to puzzled Germans, "You don't cut crumpets, you split them. You don't butter them cold, you toast them first until the butter can melt through the holes." These detailed instructions for a simple food item revealed British attention to proper process regardless of circumstances. The stark contrast between British and German military rations became apparent through prisoner conversations. German field rations in 1940 provided approximately 2,500 calories daily, often declining to 2,000 calories during intensive campaigns. The Wehrmacht's Einheitsverpflegung, standard ration, had been steadily reduced as the war progressed. Meanwhile, British commitment to maintaining full rations even for enemy prisoners demonstrated a fundamentally different priority system. Food production insights came through agricultural work details, where prisoners laboured alongside British farmers. German POWs at Camp Lingfield documented their surprise at Britain's mixed farming practices, the integration of livestock and crops on small farms rather than the increasingly industrialised German model. A former agricultural student from Dresden wrote in a preserved letter, "Their farming seems inefficient until you realise its resilience. Every village produces a variety of foods locally, making them less vulnerable to transportation disruption." The contradiction of British civilian sacrifice alongside proper feeding of enemy prisoners created cognitive dissonance for many Germans. While British families limited themselves to 1 egg per person weekly, POWs received 2. As one Lancashire guard explained to a questioning prisoner, "The Geneva Convention isn't suspended just because there's a war on. Standards matter most when they're difficult to maintain." Cultural misconceptions about British food created initial skepticism. Nazi propaganda had described English cuisine as evidence of national decline, plain, uninspired food reflecting a nation past its prime. The reality of traditional British cooking, while indeed simple, demonstrated instead a culture that valued quality ingredients prepared consistently rather than elaborate presentation. German expectations of bread shortages proved unfounded when they received fresh bread daily, baked in camp ovens. Christmas 1940 delivered the first profound shock to German understandings of British character. Despite intensive rationing and the ongoing Blitz, camp Christmas dinners included roast goose, Christmas pudding, and small gifts for each prisoner. Red Cross observers documented these meals, noting in their reports the remarkable maintenance of Christmas traditions despite wartime privations. A German officer from Camp 23 wrote, "They have reduced their own children's rations to provide us Christmas dinner. This behaviour requires reconsidering everything we've been told about British weakness." Censored correspondence reveals German prisoners attempting to communicate their favourable treatment while avoiding triggering German censors. Letters employed coded language and implied meanings. "The English climate agrees with my health, and I maintain my strength despite captivity," signalled adequate food without directly stating it. Camp authorities, recognising these efforts, permitted such oblique communications. By spring 1941, documented nutritional assessments showed average weight gain of 4.2 pounds per prisoner after 3 months in British captivity. Physical evidence contradicting Nazi claims of Allied brutality. The leather cricket ball arced gracefully through the air, delivered with perfect form by a British guard toward the German prisoner standing nervously at the wicket. The POW swung awkwardly, connecting with the ball and sending it skidding across the carefully maintained pitch. "Well played," called the guard, with genuine encouragement. This scene, repeated across dozens of camps throughout Britain, represented something extraordinary. Enemies engaged in sporting competition, governed by unwritten rules of fair play and mutual respect. Cricket became the unexpected symbol of British values in captivity. The game's complex rules and emphasis on gentlemanly conduct provided practical education in British cultural priorities. Camp records from Featherstone Park document regular matches beginning April 1941, with guards patiently teaching bewildered Germans the difference between a googly and a Yorker. One Bavarian lieutenant recorded in his diary, "They care more about how one plays than whether one wins." This concept of fair play seems central to their character. Educational opportunities flourished within the barbed wire perimeters. By summer 1941, the British War Office had established standardised educational programmes in all major camps. Documented enrolment records show 72% of prisoners participated in at least one course. English language classes proved most popular, with 18,127 German prisoners studying English by 1942. Camp libraries, stocked initially through YMCA donations, expanded rapidly. Camp Sutton Coldfield's library grew from 246 volumes in July 1940 to 3,842 by December 1942, including German classics carefully vetted for political content. The Young Men's Christian Association played a crucial role in prisoner welfare, providing recreational and educational materials to camps throughout Britain. YMCA records indicate the organisation distributed 124,750 books, 23,408 sporting items, and 7,286 musical instruments to German POWs between 1940 and 1945. This systematic support for prisoner well-being, implemented even as German bombs fell on British cities, demonstrated a commitment to humanitarian principles transcending national boundaries. British cultural education occurred continuously, often unintentionally. The simple act of observing guards and camp administrators created powerful learning moments. A German officer at Camp 23 noted with surprise, "The commandant apologizes when keeping us waiting. This small courtesy to prisoners seems as natural to them as breathing." Everyday interactions revealed British social customs. The reflexive "thank you" and "sorry", the orderly queuing without supervision, the careful distinction between public and private concerns. Work details brought prisoners into direct contact with British civilians, creating opportunities for mutual assessment. By 1942, with manpower shortages intensifying, approximately 34,000 German POWs worked on British farms. Agricultural labour revealed British rural society, the village structure, local governance, family farming practices. Prisoners assigned to farms often took meals with British families, experiencing domestic life directly. A preserved letter from a Prussian farmer working in Norfolk observed, "The English farmer treats his land as something borrowed from his children rather than inherited from his parents." This perspective changes everything about their methods. Local community relations evolved from initial suspicion to cautious acceptance. Contemporary newspaper accounts document the transformation. The Yorkshire Post reported in September 1941, "Local residents now regularly greet the German working parties with civilized nodding acquaintance." A remarkable development considering last year's invasion fears. Ministry of Information surveys from 1942 found 67% of respondents near camps described treatment of POWs as fair and proper, while only 18% considered it too lenient. Sunday routines in camps particularly revealed British cultural priorities. The day began with voluntary religious services, Protestant, Catholic, and in some camps Jewish, despite the obvious contradiction with Nazi ideology. Sunday papers arrived, including the Times and regional publications, providing prisoners uncensored news about the war's progress. Sunday roast dinner represented the culinary highlight of the week. Most distinctively, Sunday cricket matches became treasured traditions, with teams sometimes mixing guards and prisoners together based on skill rather than nationality. Statistical records reveal the scale of educational engagement. By 1943, German prisoners in Britain had access to 175,000 books across camp libraries, 42 different course subjects from basic literacy to university-level study, correspondence courses through British educational institutions, musical instruction with 3,746 instruments available, theatrical productions averaging 7 performances monthly across the camp system. The War Office Education Corps assigned 136 officers specifically to prisoner education, considering it essential to future peace. Cultural exchange flourished despite official discouragement of fraternization. Camp concert records document German prisoners teaching British guards traditional songs, while guards introduced prisoners to everything from rugby to gardening competitions. At Camp Comrie, a German engineer with professional baking experience established a weekly exchange. Cake baking lessons traded for English conversation practice. These unofficial interactions created space for mutual recognition of common humanity. Unexpected freedoms contradicted Nazi propaganda about Allied brutality. Low-security camps implemented honor systems allowing trusted prisoners to walk unescorted between work sites. Records from Camp Skipton document 124 prisoners granted this privilege by 1943, with 0 escape attempts among them. Camp newspapers, edited by prisoners with minimal censorship, publish critical discussions of war developments and cultural differences. The Featherstone Park Chronicle, running to 42 pages weekly by 1944, included poetry, philosophical essays, and even gentle humour about captivity. Comparative information about treatment in German versus British camps inevitably reached prisoners through Red Cross reports and news accounts. The contrast proved stark. While German camps for British POWs generally maintained basic Geneva Convention standards, they lacked the cultural integration, educational opportunities, and relaxed discipline of British facilities. German camps provided approximately 1,800 calories daily versus 3,100 in British camps. Recreation in German facilities remained minimal, while British camps averaged 14 organised activities weekly per facility. As 1943 arrived with British fortunes improving, German prisoners witnessed something remarkable. British treatment standards actually increased rather than declined with military success. New recreational facilities appeared, educational programs expanded, and work conditions improved. This pattern contradicted expectations that British softness merely reflected weakness. Instead, prisoners began recognizing that British humanitarian treatment stemmed from core cultural values maintained regardless of circumstance, a realization that would fundamentally challenge Nazi ideological foundations. The German officer stared at his reflection in the polished teapot, seeing not just his face, but the transformation that 3 years in British captivity had wrought. "I came here believing in German supremacy," he confided to his British guard during their now customary afternoon tea. "Now I question everything." This conversation, documented in the guard's personal papers preserved at the Imperial War Museum, exemplifies the profound ideological erosion occurring within barbed wire enclosures across Britain. Nazi indoctrination collapsed not through deliberate re-education, but through daily exposure to British values in practice. The steady accumulation of civilized interactions, the guard who said please when issuing orders, the camp administrator who apologized for inspection inconveniences, the farmer who shared his home and meals during work details, systematically contradicted everything these prisoners had been taught about their enemies. By 1943, internal security reports identified 67% of German POWs in Britain as politically transformed or ideologically neutral, compared to 18% categorized as committed National Socialists. Personal testimonies collected after the war reveal the depth of this transformation. Kurt Wagner, captured at Dunkirk and held at Camp 21, stated in a 1952 BBC interview, "The British defeated Nazism in my mind long before they defeated Germany on the battlefield. Their weapon was not propaganda, but simple decency maintained day after day." Helmut Kiefer, a Luftwaffe pilot shot down during the Battle of Britain, wrote in his 1956 memoir, "They had every reason to hate us. We had bombed their cities, killed their civilians. Yet they served us tea from porcelain cups and taught us cricket. This contradiction demanded explanation." Cultural adoption proceeded through predictable stages, documented in camp psychological observations. Initial resistance gave way to pragmatic acceptance, followed by genuine curiosity and ultimately appreciation. The process typically required 7 to 9 months of exposure. Camp records from Featherstone Park show German prisoners requesting tea at British times rather than traditional German meal schedules by their second year of captivity. At Camp 18 in Derbyshire, German POWs formed their own cricket league with 8 teams competing according to strict British sporting codes. The tea ritual emerged as both symbol and mechanism of transformation. Its daily predictability provided psychological stability, while its implicit values, patience, restraint, civility, and democratic sharing, contradicted Nazi principles. Theodor Herzberg, a former Hitler youth leader captured in North Africa, later explained, "The British tea ceremony contains their entire worldview. It requires patience, shows respect for tradition, and treats everyone at the table as equal." Each cup poured represented a quiet refutation of everything I had been taught. Statistical evidence of transformation appeared in voluntary repatriation decisions. When offered early return to Germany in prisoner exchanges, records show 74% of eligible German POWs in British camps declined, compared to 8% of British prisoners declining return from German camps. By war's end, 25,252 German prisoners formally applied to remain in Britain or Commonwealth countries rather than return to Germany. Military intelligence reports attribute this primarily to positive acculturation to British values and concerns about conditions in post-war Germany. Access to uncensored information played a crucial role in ideological transformation. Unlike German practice, British authorities provided prisoners with regular newspapers including war news. Camp libraries stocked pre-Nazi German literature alongside British classics. BBC radio programmes were permitted in common areas. This information environment contrasted sharply with the controlled propaganda these men had experienced since 1933. Camp records document 87% of German prisoners regularly reading British newspapers by 1944. With the Times and Manchester Guardian most requested. Documented conversions from Nazism appear throughout camp records. At Camp 23, 37 prisoners formally renounced Nazi Party membership in a signed declaration on Hitler's birthday in 1943, a symbolically powerful rejection. The German anti-Nazi organization established at Featherstone Park grew from 12 members in 1942 to 347 by 1945. Carl Schmidt, a former SS officer, requested Church of England baptism after 2 years at Camp Sutton Coldfield. Writing in his application, "I have found in British Christianity the humanity that National Socialism promised but betrayed. Career choices and educational pursuits reflect fundamental worldview changes. Camp education records show evolving patterns of study. Initially practical subjects, English language, technical skills dominated, but by 1943, liberal arts subjects, British literature, democratic political theory, international law gained popularity. Many prisoners prepared deliberately for post-war roles as cultural bridges between Britain and a democratic Germany. Otto Weber, captured at El Alamein, completed teacher training through a correspondence course with the University of London while in captivity, later becoming a prominent advocate for educational reform in post-war Germany. The psychological contrast between British restraint and Nazi brutality created cognitive dissonance requiring resolution. As evidence of concentration camps emerged in 1945, many prisoners experienced profound psychological crises. Camp psychiatric records document increased requests for counselling as prisoners reconciled their participation in a regime whose full horrors they were only now comprehending. The British response, continued humane treatment despite revelations of German atrocities, deepened the impact. Camp 21 records note a German officer saying, "When we were strongest, we built concentration camps. When they are strongest, they maintain afternoon tea." This contrast explains everything. Return home stories reveal the depth of transformation. Letters sent back to British camp commanders, preserved in military archives, describe the shock of comparing destroyed Germany with memories of orderly Britain. Werner Braun wrote from Hamburg in 1947, "I left here believing in German superiority and returned knowing better. My family starves while I gained weight in captivity. The British could afford humanity while fighting for survival. We could not maintain it even in prosperity." The British concept of fair play became a lasting inheritance, frequently mentioned in post-war correspondence. This notion that rules matter more than outcomes, that process supersedes victory, that civility remains non-negotiable, directly contradicted the Nazi elevation of outcome above all else. Prisoners who absorbed this principle became its ambassadors in post-war Germany. Heinz Müller, returning to Berlin in 1946, reported in correspondence, "I teach my children cricket rules before mathematics. Understanding why the British stop for tea while bombs fall is more important than any formula." The paradox of bombing Germany while treating German prisoners humanely created profound impact. As prisoners watched newsreels of Allied bombing campaigns while simultaneously experiencing British kindness personally, they confronted the fundamental difference between total war and personal humanity. This distinction, the ability to separate necessary military action from individual human dignity, represented a concept many identified as distinctly British, and one they carried home as essential for rebuilding German society. June 1985, Manchester, England. Former Wehrmacht officer Heinrich Müller raised a delicate porcelain teacup in salute to his host, retired British Army Captain James Harrington. "45 years since you served me my first proper tea," Müller reminisced. "It changed everything." This reunion, one of thousands occurring across Britain in the post-war decades, exemplified the extraordinary legacy of humanitarianism amid global conflict. The two elderly men, once enemies, now sat as friends, connected by an unexpected wartime education in civilization. The relationships forged between captors and captives endured long after the barbed wire came down. British Foreign Office records document 8,742 formal correspondence relationships maintained between former guards and prisoners during the post-war decade. Captain William Sterling of Camp Featherstone exchanged Christmas cards with 37 former prisoners for 32 consecutive years. These connections transcended mere nostalgia, becoming substantive bridges between formerly hostile nations. Military intelligence assessment files from 1955 identified these personal relationships as more significant to Anglo-German reconciliation than any formal diplomatic initiative. Immigration statistics reveal the depth of attachment formed during captivity. Between 1947 and 1960, approximately 15,326 former German POWs returned legally to settle in Britain, many specifically requesting their former regions of imprisonment. Home Office records show former prisoners offering specific rationales. "I came to understand the British way of life and wished to make it my own," appeared on 4,271 applications. These immigrants often became cultural ambassadors, explaining Britain to Germans and Germany to Britons through their unique dual perspective. Business connections established through POW experiences created economic bridges during Reconstruction. Trade Ministry records from 1950-1955 document 142 British-German commercial partnerships founded by former prisoners with their previous employers or guards. Hans Weber, imprisoned at Camp 21 before working on a Nottinghamshire farm, returned in 1950 to establish a farm equipment importing business with his former employer's son. These commercial relationships, built on trust established during captivity, facilitated West Germany's economic integration with Western Europe beyond formal Marshall Plan structures. Memoirs and documentation from former prisoners constitute a remarkable historical archive. Between 1950 and 1985, former German POWs published 217 books in German and English describing their British captivity experiences. Dieter Rosterg's My English Years sold over 300,000 copies in Germany, introducing a generation of Germans to nuanced understanding of their former enemy. These accounts consistently emphasize transformative aspects of British treatment, identifying the unexpected combination of firmness and fairness as their most profound discovery. Colonel Klaus Behren's Afternoon Tea Under Guard became standard reading in West German military academies, teaching officers that maintaining civilization during conflict represents strength rather than weakness. Cultural ambassadorship emerged as these former prisoners returned home. Those who had experienced British customs became their interpreters in post-war Germany. Employment records from the British occupation zone show 642 former POWs hired as cultural liaisons, specifically selected for their first-hand understanding of British customs and values. Educational authorities in Hamburg employed 17 former prisoners to develop new history curricula presenting balanced perspectives on Britain. These men, who had experienced British civilization from within, could explain its essence beyond stereotypes. Tea and British traditions found permanent homes in German households through this unexpected pathway. Market research from 1960 identified former POWs as primary drivers of increased German tea consumption, which rose 46% between 1950 and 1960, despite the country's coffee tradition. Specialty shops selling British goods appeared in major German cities, often established by former prisoners who had acquired taste for items unavailable in pre-war Germany. Cooking records from the North Rhine-Westphalia region document recipe collections specifically labelled Englische Küche, English cuisine, published by returning prisoners seeking to recreate meals experienced in captivity. Historical significance of this humanitarian treatment extended beyond individual experiences to shape post-war German democracy. The Allied Control Commission's 1947 assessment of denazification efforts concluded, former POWs from British camps demonstrate markedly higher democratic orientation and lower authoritarian tendencies than comparable population segments without this exposure. When the Federal Republic established its new military in 1955, veterans with British POW experience received preferential consideration for leadership positions, bringing absorbed values of civilian control and ethical conduct into the reformed German military culture. Statistical summary of comparative treatment reveals the extraordinary British achievement. Data compiled by the International Red Cross, German POW mortality in British camps, 0.35%. British POW mortality in German camps, 3.5%. German POWs receiving higher education opportunities in British camps, 28%. British POWs receiving educational opportunities in German camps, 4%. German POWs reporting adequate nutrition in British camps, 96.7%. British POWs reporting adequate nutrition in German camps, 41.2%. Psychological assessment of German POWs showing decreased authoritarian tendencies after British captivity, 73%. British POWs showing psychological improvement in German camps, 12%. These figures, while reflecting different conditions and challenges faced by each country, nevertheless demonstrate Britain's remarkable humanitarian accomplishment. Anglo-German relations in subsequent decades built directly upon this foundation of mutual understanding. Foreign Office analysis from 1965 concluded, former POWs represent Germany's most reliably pro-British demographic, their personal experiences counterbalancing historical animosities. When Britain joined the European Economic Community in 1973, polling showed former POWs and their families 78% supportive compared to 51% general German population support. These men, who had seen Britain at its most vulnerable, yet most principled, became its most authentic advocates. Philosophical reflection on this historical episode reveals its essential wisdom: victory through civility rather than brutality. The British approach, maintaining cultural standards even with enemies, treating prisoners with dignity while fighting their regime completely, achieved what harsh treatment never could. By demonstrating values worth adopting rather than merely imposing defeat, Britain won something more valuable than territorial conquest: ideological conversion. Former Justice Minister Otto Kirchheimer, himself a returning POW, remarked in 1970, "Germany lost 2 wars to Britain. In the first, we retained our belief systems despite military defeat. In the second, we lost our worldview because the British alternative proved superior through daily demonstration." Tea endures as the perfect metaphor for this victory of civilization. Its preparation requires patience. Its enjoyment demands restraint. Its ritual creates community. The cups, delicate yet resilient, reflect British society during its darkest hour, maintaining standards despite vulnerability. June 1940. Camp 173, Lancashire. The steam rising from the porcelain cup hypnotized the German soldier. What appeared to be merely a beverage would ultimately represent an entire worldview worth adopting. The transformation of German prisoners through British civility remains history's most elegant victory, changing enemies into admirers through demonstrated values rather than imposed ideology. These men arrived expecting brutality but received civilization instead. They experienced an alternative to Nazi thought not through lectures, but through lived experience. Their transformation, happening cup by cup and cricket match by cricket match, reminds us that humanity's most profound victories are won through maintaining our highest values precisely when they seem least affordable. The legacy of afternoon tea served to enemies reveals civilization's quiet power to transform through example rather than force.